I'm a big believer in second chances, even for people who commit serious crimes. Who deserves a second chance? Who gets one? And who decides? I'm Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host of Just Justice. I'm a former public defender, a professor of justice studies, and an award-winning author. And I'm excited for us to find new ways to put justice back into our criminal legal system. Hello, and welcome to Just Justice. My name is Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host. Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Aliza Kaplan, professor of law and director of the Criminal Justice Reform Clinic at Lewis and Clark Law School in Oregon. She's a nationally recognized leader in wrongful convictions and in systemic reform. She's the co-founder of the England Innocence Project, serves as counsel to the Forensic Justice Project, and helped create the Community Law Division of the Metropolitan Public Defender. Aliza is a renowned legal scholar and, fun fact, she's also a documentary film producer. Aliza Kaplan, welcome to the show. I'm a real fan of your work.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So let's get started with your journey. You've been part of innocence work at the national level in New England and now in Oregon. What first drew you to wrongful convictions and to the idea of systemic reform in the criminal legal system?
I always talk about my journey, my lawyer journey. I always talk about it with my students because I think it's always really important to know that what you think you might be doing when you go to law school isn't what you end up doing on the way out or down the road. And so when I was in law school, I had absolutely no interest in doing anything criminal law. I had an interest in, I was against the death penalty. I think I did I did do a law clinic where I wrote petitions to the US Supreme Court. This is in the 90s for people who were facing the death penalty. Um, and they all got rejected, but it was, a learning process of, writing and a clinic in law school. So, I cared enough to be involved in criminal law that way, but I never really had any interest in being a criminal lawyer. And after I finished law school, I clerked for a federal judge, and then I went to a big law firm, and I knew I wasn't going to stay there. It was more like I didn't know what I was going to do. And I went to law school to be a public interest lawyer. I thought it was going to be like in the civil rights maybe area. And I couldn't find a job doing that. So I went to a big firm. And on my second or third day of work, one of the managing partners walked in. I was in Boston and said, we're starting the New England Innocence Project. Do you know what that is? And I was like, yes, I know what the Innocence Project is. It was still very new back then. But I remember, the founders were the OJ lawyers, and that was, a big thing back then. And he said,
It was really a
it
big
was a
thing.
really big thing, right? And my boss at the time said, we're going to start the New England Innocence Project out of this law firm, and you're going to be one of the two people that does it. And I was like, okay. And so for the next year and a half, I billed almost half my hours to starting the New England Innocence Project. And we got boxes of cases from the national project, which was at Cardozo Law School at the time. And that's how it all started. So I founded the New England Innocence Project. I walked my first client out of prison in March 2001. And, that was it for me. And within, like months, I was in New York as the deputy director for the national project. I wanted to go home to New York. I was in Boston for law school and right after, but I wanted to go home. So it kind of worked out, went home, started working at National Innocence Project. We were just a team of about 5 people then.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then I was there while we sort of transformed, professionalized, went from a law clinic to a national organization. And, still blows my mind when I think about how many people work there now and all the amazing things. And then when I moved out to Oregon, almost 15 years ago, there was no Innocence Project, and everyone was like, "Are you going to start an Innocence Project?" And so eventually I did. I did, and then I moved on and started my law clinic where I help guilty people mostly.
Right, you started the criminal justice reform clinic, right?
Mhm.
And what is it that you do there? So it's not an innocence clinic, it's
No,
representing people who were convicted, or is it pre-conviction?
yeah. I mean, our ultimate goal is to represent individuals, work in legislature and on various policies, to like on the back end of the criminal legal system. And sometimes, more than sometimes, we do end up with innocence cases, but that's just because we learn that. In fact, we just won a parole case the other day, we found out, and the guy has been in prison since 1978. And
Oh,
we argued innocence and rehabilitation. So, there are innocent people in Oregon's prisons, and there was never an innocence project. And just because my clinic now works in these other spaces, parole, clemency, um, there's a process here called Senate Bill 819 where we join a prosecutor and we can change someone's sentence. The clinic wrote that bill and we passed it, and now we get to use it all over the state. But because we work a lot on very old cases, we often bump into an innocence case, right? And so then, but we're not trying for innocence cases. A lot of our focus in our casework is people, what we call second chance lawyering. And it's people who've committed very horrible crimes, and it's many, many years later, and they've done all the work, and they definitely don't need to be in prison anymore. We also, work on all sorts of issues relating to excessive sentencing, and we'll chime in with amicus briefs at different levels of court, and we'll work in the legislature to change laws.
yeah, and we're gonna talk about some of your amicus work in just a minute. But so, I had somebody on the show who talked about prosecutor-initiated resentencing, and I forgot that Oregon is one of the states that has that. How's that been
Yeah.
going? Has it been effective?
Yeah, it's really interesting. We passed the law in 2021. It went into effect in 22. And it's being used in many, many counties, not just by us. Obviously, lots of other folks are using it too. I would say that it's mostly being used for collateral consequences. So for people who are already out and they have an old felony on their record that is not expungible, DAs will be joining them, defense lawyers, to remove it or lessen it and then expunge it.
Oh,
Um, and that's great. I mean, our expungement law covers all misdemeanors and a couple felonies, but it doesn't cover most felonies. So, we've used it in that way to get rid of all types of felonies from, drug related felonies, robberies, manslaughter, right? And it allows the person who's sort of stuck with these felonies on their record and it's affecting their daily life, right? To housing and jobs and visiting their kids' schools as volunteers and getting certifications. So it acts like a pardon almost, right? And it just get rid of it.
but it's not helping people who have, as you were talking about, done the work and done the reform, get out of
Sometimes, but
prison.
I think less, right?
Huh,
So I've
okay.
used it for people and that's just because our DAs aren't willing. Yeah.
I'm sorry, just to stay with
Yeah.
that for just a minute. It's an interesting thing, right? Because one of the criticisms, one of the questions that were raised about prosecutor initiated resentencing laws is exactly that. Are prosecutors really going to be willing to undo sentences obtained by their own offices? And if I'm hearing you correctly, in many cases, or at least in Oregon, they're not.
Well, I think it's more the moment that we're in than I would say it's a blanket no. I mean, I like our reform DA in Portland and Multnomah County lost his job because of all the I hate saying the pendulum swings because I say it so many times. But
But it's
but
wrong.
also, there was a campaign, a media and huge money campaign to get rid of him, right? And so that's happening in the background, the post-COVID crime spike, which is now completely, at its lowest in 20 years. But in that moment, it gave everyone sort of permission to, move the other way and become tough on crime. And obviously what's coming from at the national level gives that permission as well. So there, DAs would have to be super brave to be working to help get people out of prison. But we certainly used it a handful of times with him and with other DAs. I mean, one of the ways I think DAs here have been brave is, people who have committed really serious crimes. I have a couple cases where the person is in prison for murder and is going to eventually go to the parole board. But while they were in prison early on, they picked up another case,
Mm-hmm.
before they rehabilitated in the early years. And I've gone to DAs and said, look, he's going to go to the parole board and they're going to have to judge him in 2 years from now. But he has 5 years. So even if he's successful at the board, he's going to have to spend 5 more years. How do you feel about getting rid of that or cutting that down or whatever? And DAs have been willing to do that if the person, is shown to have done all the right things. So, there are ways, I think, to be creative. There's ways to change. I was just advising someone about, don't ask for release, ask to make consecutive sentences, ask to make them concurrent. And that's, I think, a way where DAs then don't have to suffer the the media or the ridicule or whatever it is they're getting in cases that, people that they even think, someone might be a good candidate.
Yeah, yeah, interesting.
Have to be creative, I think, with
Yeah,
that.
very, very interesting. I know you've done some really pivotal work on the issue of non-unanimous juries. And I'm wondering if you could, one, explain why that matters, and two, what the issue, sort of explain it to us because we don't know. And then tell us what happened.
Yeah, this is, my favorite story to tell on so many levels. It's like kind of a perfect issue that I worked on for 7 years. And still it's, the gift that keeps on giving in some ways. I moved to Oregon almost 15 years ago. And when I got here, I learned that Oregon was one of 2 states that had non-unanimous juries in criminal felony cases. The other is Louisiana. And that means that 1 or 2 members of a jury can not think that the state proved their case or think the person's innocent in front of them, but it doesn't matter and the person can still be convicted. And
Wait,
so,
just to interrupt you. So, like in other states,
yeah,
you mean
other
like it has to
states
be unanimous? All
federally,
12 people have to
right,
say you are guilty if someone's going to be
right,
convicted. And if one person has a question, thinks they're innocent, then it's
that's
a
it.
hung jury. It's a
You're
mistrial.
acquitted, right.
Right. Okay.
And so, all of these cases in both states, in any other state or at the federal level, the person would never have been convicted. Yet, Oregon had its law since 1934, um, and in Louisiana, it was right after slavery ended. Within a couple of years, they put a law in place. And in both states, it became part of their constitutions. So it's really like very hard to, once something's in a state constitution or federal constitution, right? You don't just say, oh, we don't like this anymore. It's not just a statute where the legislature can change it. It has to either be removed by ballot measure and the people vote, or it has to be found unconstitutional.
So in Louisiana, that constitutional change happens after slavery is abolished. And so, arguably, there's some link there to the idea that we're going to get all white juries to convict Black defendants primarily. But what's the history in Oregon?
Yeah, well, first in Louisiana, it was really that they didn't have their workforce anymore. And so they wanted to get as many people convicted as possible as part of, Black code laws and throughout the South. And in Louisiana, this was one thing that they did. And so they could have their labor, and they were people in prison would do the labor. And in Oregon, it was also so based fully in discrimination, obviously, in Louisiana. And that doesn't surprise most people considering the history of the South and everything. But here in Oregon, our law went into place also based on discrimination, a different kind. And it was really it was anti-Semitism, anti-Catholicism, anti-immigration at the time here. I'm sure it would have been, anti-Black people too, but we really didn't. We had lots of redlining laws and stuff, and not that many Black people, and we still don't. And but at the time, there was this big trial that took place, and it was a Jewish gangster guy who was on trial for murder. And the jury couldn't reach a decision on murder, and they ended up settling the case at manslaughter and like $500 and one night in jail or something. Keep in mind, obviously, the sentencing was really different back then. But the local paper followed this case day to day to day, and what you see in the newspaper is just on and on, like beating the drum of anti-immigration, anti-Semitism, going on and on and on. And eventually, less than a year later, on the ballot was a non-unanimous jury law, and it cited this case as one of the main reasons why. And so when I moved here, I said, what is this? I'm a defense lawyer. I'm a criminal lawyer. I'm a professor. I do not understand reasonable doubt. Right? I teach that. So this is reasonable doubt. And so I remember saying to people, oh, I'm going to get rid of that. Well, I didn't even know anything about it, but it was so insane to me. And so for me, whenever I am faced with an issue like that something seems so unjust, I need to know how did this happen? Like, how did we get here? And so I did the research, a student and I did the research, and I just told you the very short version of how the law came to be. And once I learned that, I was like, that's it. We're definitely getting rid of this. And it became an obsession. I wrote a law review article with all the history. And I also decided I need to just get this out there. People need to know. How come no one had looked that up before? It wasn't that hard to figure out. So that was it. Started showing up in amicus briefs. I started telling the defense bar to start polling all the juries. And unfortunately, for 85 years, people were not polling the juries. So it's really
Wow.
Yeah, Louisiana has a little bit better of a record, but here we had almost, but not, it's still not good enough. And here we really have no record of how many people were convicted by non-unanimous jury. And so, but I was doing everything I could to let people know. My friends in Louisiana were filing brief after brief after brief, trying to get the US Supreme Court to take the case. We were filing amicus with them, amicus, the Oregon story. And finally, on the 23rd try, after Louisiana had already changed their law through ballot measure, the US Supreme Court took the case, and Ramos versus Louisiana, and they ruled exactly how they should, which is, that really, interestingly, the legal issue is not about reasonable doubt. It's not about the historical parts, although they mention both. It's really about incorporation, our Bill of Rights, into the states under the 14th Amendment. Which is what my law review article was about. Also, I don't think any of us thought that wouldn't happen. I think once they took the case, I think the law was pretty clear at that time. Obviously, you never know. But that came out. It was like, right? Everyone was so happy. And then people started filing here, right? But we didn't have a ruling saying it was retroactive. So going forward, we knew what the law was. But looking backwards, for all these people who were currently incarcerated or formerly incarcerated, or people who did their time, but they could prove that their lawyers did poll the jury, or there's something in their record, they deserved that justice. And so the US Supreme Court said, at the federal level, it's not retroactive. But if you states want to do whatever you want to do, that's fine. 2 years later, in 2022, the very end, the Oregon Supreme Court ruled that Ramos was retroactive.
Hmm,
And so,
that's amazing.
and unfortunately in Louisiana, they were unsuccessful in their courts and they're still fighting at the legislature.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So in Oregon, do you have a sense at all of how much that Ramos and then the 2022 Oregon
Yeah,
Supreme Court case has had an impact?
it certainly had an impact. Hundreds of people walked out of prison, or walked out, meaning out of prison, mostly to jail. Because what happens when you win post conviction on a constitutional issue, you go back to the beginning of your case, which does feel very unjust to people. So people's cases were vacated, but then they have to start over. And
Yeah.
so the result is a lot of plea deals, a lot of, some retrials. Um, and, I could go through lots of little examples of ones that seem fair and ones that don't seem fair. But, the truth is, like the details of anyone's case can't kind of matter in an issue like this. It's really about, like the law being constitutional.
Mhm, mhm.
And what I think should happen to all the cases kind of doesn't matter. It's more that we shouldn't have a system that can convict people when there's reasonable doubt. And we shouldn't have anyone in prison or have a conviction on their record unless they've been adjudicated in a fair and just and constitutional way.
Yeah. Well done. I mean, that's kind of cool. You move to a new state and you're like, I'm getting rid of that thing. And
Yeah,
then
I
there
got
you
a
go.
list, by the way. I have a list. So I'm working on some other stuff now too.
Ooh, do you want to share?
Yeah, I'm working on felony murder, which, I know there's some other state advocates around doing that. It's another thing. It's not just Oregon that just really drives me crazy. Like for the people who didn't do the murder, the fact that they're getting sentences like they committed a murder is so wrong to me. I'm not saying people don't deserve responsibility for what they did. If they went to the house to rob it and had no idea there was anyone there or that anyone had a weapon, why should they also get 25 years? They should get what they did, right? That's what they should be charged with, and that's what they should go to trial for or be responsible for.
Right.
So
And so for people who don't know what she's referencing, when Aliza says felony murder, she's talking about folks who, while they're committing a felony, a murder occurs, somebody dies, and you can be held liable for that murder, even if you had no intent to commit that murder. And people are then sentenced for the murder. So she's saying there's something unjust about holding people who did not intend to commit murder, and who
yeah,
may have had nothing to do with the
right.
murder,
Right.
to hold them.
Intention is such a big part of a murder conviction, um, and culpability that it's like another one of those things. It just doesn't seem to make sense within all the laws and rules that we do have, right? And constitution. And so, yeah, I'm looking at it in Oregon. I'm not sure yet what's going to happen, but I'm looking at it from a few different directions, and you heard it here first.
There you go.
See
Just
what
justice,
happens.
folks. We've got it.
Yeah.
We're on the front line here.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, a lot of your work, in addition to sort of what we've just been talking about, has focused on clemency. It's focused on parole, all of which fall right into the idea of second chances. Um, and that's what this podcast focuses on. So maybe
Yeah.
you could tell us about what brought you into the second chance space,
Mhm.
and maybe how you see second chances as being so tied to justice. So maybe tell us a little bit about your work in clemency and maybe a little bit
Yeah.
about parole and your
Yeah.
thoughts about second chances generally.
Yeah, I came to it because when I started this clinic, I wanted to be in a space that nobody was in yet. And as a past innocence lawyer, my background is on the back end of the criminal legal system doing post conviction.
Yeah, and I don't want to interrupt you, but you've said that now twice. Could you explain what you mean when you say back end?
Yeah, and maybe I just made up that word, I don't know.
No,
Uh,
no. Oh, I've
or
I've
okay.
I've heard it before, but for the folks who are listening who don't
Yeah.
know, could you explain?
So much of when we hear about crime and criminal justice, it's on the front end, right? People get arrested, they get charged, they go to trial, they do a plea deal, juries, all these things, right? And that's where all the focus is in the public sphere, even in law school, right? It's when people learn about criminal law, it's criminal procedure. Like, can I suppress this, right? It's, how does it work? People go become public defenders and prosecutors, and right, all of that is the front end. Then someone gets convicted in some form, right? And they go into the system. And after that, there's appeals, direct appeals, which are based on what happened at the trial level. And there's something called post conviction, which is a mechanism that every state has where you're kind of bringing a collateral case, looking at your original case and asking, are there any constitutional issues? So, was my lawyer effective under the Constitution? The non unanimous jury issue was there. Did the state withhold important information in my case? Prosecutorial misconduct. All of that's this post conviction relief collateral. And then after that, you're pretty much done. You have appeals, and then you're pretty much done. A lot of people then get these extreme sentences because of mandatory minimums. They stack them up, make them consecutive, or like in the felony murder situation, they get ones that maybe they don't deserve, et cetera, et cetera. So, all of that space, starting with post conviction and on, is sort of the space that my clinic works in. And
Mm,
we mostly represent people who have committed horrible crimes like murder, and most of the casework that we do is us looking at really old cases. And one, on the second chances, is there an opportunity for them to leave prison? And a lot of people have a 25 years to life with parole sentence. In Oregon, the only remaining cases for release that go to the parole board are either murder cases where someone has a life with parole sentence, or they have certain juvenile uh, convictions. That's it.
mm.
And so we take all of those cases, and the legal standard for those is the person basically capable of rehabilitation? It's We look at the same issues when we're doing clemency, and we had a governor before the one we have now who it took us a few years, but we got her interested in clemency, and she ended up letting over 100 individual people. A lot of them had committed very serious crimes out of prison. She pardoned, so cleared old records of over 100 people, a lot of them serious crimes. And she did big group clemencies,
Mhm.
like sending a whole bunch of our youth to the parole board and commuting our death penalty. And we, feel we did a lot of those cases,
That's
a
awesome.
couple of those groups, and we feel like that was our issue for about 5 or 6 years, and we were a machine here doing them, and we worked really hard to convince her about why people who have been in prison for a really long time are the safest people to let out of prison. And that's pretty much our philosophy here, right? And that's why I really enjoy taking these second chance cases. It's why they're incredible cases for my students to work on. And they're really non-traditional lawyering. And really, I don't know if personal is the right word, but you really get to know your clients really, really well, and really truly can understand what the experience, as close as someone can that hasn't experienced prison. We really grow to really understand the dynamics, opportunities, lack of opportunities, day-to-day life in prison. And for my students who are going to go work on the front end, almost all of them, prosecutors and defense lawyers, I think it's crucial that they understand what happens to both of them will be a part of putting people in prison, even, the defense lawyers
Yeah,
just as
yeah,
much.
sure.
And for them to really have that understanding and compassion of what someone's life is like in prison with a long sentence, I think and they go to prison a lot. We spend a lot of time in prison. Um, I think is a really important part of their education. So,
Yeah, I mean, I've had the privilege really of serving on the New Jersey Clemency Advisory Board.
nice.
And Governor Murphy is sort of really leaning in his last 18
I
months.
know.
And
I
it's
love
been
that.
very interesting looking at his approach to categorical clemency. And you're right, there's an intimacy in these applications because the folks who are applying are really talking about the arc of their lives once they've been convicted and what's happened to them and who they've become in the course of their prison sentence. And
And also
met,
we do a lot of like, how did you become the person who would commit a horrible crime? Like, we need to talk about that more. That's how we stop crime,
yeah. Well,
right?
say more about that. Like, I mean, I understand what you're
Yeah.
saying, but say more about that.
I mean, we want a lot of easy fixes, right? And that's why the pendulum swing. We're like, this isn't working. Move over here. One bad crime, right? And we like to throw blame around and everything. But the truth is, crime, it's like I say this every day in class, crime is complicated. And there's so many issues among families, communities, drugs, mental health. I mean, all these things contribute to people committing crimes. And that's not 100%, but it's a very high percentage. And trauma. And, I would say 80% of my clients themselves are victims of crimes, different types of abuse, etc. And our system has a really in order for it to work in the way it's working now, which it isn't working, but in the way we know it is, there's bad people and good people. And, it's kind of interesting how my clients are never really, because they've committed a crime, they're never actual victims, right? And how we define all these different roles in the system. And it's I have learned so much, and I know my students would all say this too, from the people we represent. The fact that they live in the worst place with very little to help them rehabilitate, especially in our Eastern Oregon prisons. There's no volunteers, there's nothing going on, there's almost no programs, right? But they figure it out, right? And they become really incredible people that take accountability for their actions, that are filled with remorse, that want to help other people and do help people, that educate themselves, that read tons of books, that when there's programs available, do all the programs, deal with their addictions, their mental health. I mean, it's so incredible how people can change. It's so hopeful. It's beautiful. Um, I truly believe that people can change, and I think I always thought that, but I think in the last 15 years, I've just seen it so much. And people also age out of crime, and I don't have any real concern about my clients who have spent 25 years in prison and done all the work. I have no concerns about them leaving prison and being safe, right? If they've done the work, a lot of them are like 56-year-old men, or women, and you know, what their goals and what they aspire to at that point is they're just completely different people.
Yeah, if they look back, they're like, I know I did that thing, but
Yeah, or they were
who
caught
was
up
I
in
with them? Yeah,
gangs
yeah,
or,
exactly.
and when you learn the why and what their lives were like, it actually makes somewhat sense that they would be in such a bad place that
Hmm.
they would go on to harm somebody else, right?
Yeah, and have I know you've seen this firsthand because you've been such an effective advocate. Can you share a story or an example that sort of really illustrates the impact of second chances?
I have so many. It's so it's just beautiful to see someone who grew up in a gang and whose entire, family was either gone or also wrapped up in gangs or violence, or their mom was during the crack epidemic of the 90s, or, like just such tragedy, growing up with a gang, ending up committing a horrible crime in that role, going to prison in the first bunch of years, having a really hard time because, the
Mhm.
gangs are all in prison, and they're in a lot closer quarters, and there's lots of race issues and neighborhood issues and all this stuff. And so often people go in very angry, and first bunch of years they are in solitary confinement a lot and they're getting fights and all that. And then something happens and it's different for everyone. It could be like an outside force, like a kid, on the outside saying, "Hey, dad, I'm not having a relationship with you," right? Unless or just like having a relationship. It could be being in solitary. I have a client who, this is probably one of my favorite things I tell people. I have a client who went in at 15 for a double murder. He had a sentence that he was never going to get out of prison. And he was in and out of the whole first 10 years he was in there.
And the whole is solitary
Oh, solitary
confinement, right?
confinement. Sorry.
Yeah, so it's a horrible
Weak,
in most
awful,
countries, it's
dirty
considered torture, right? In most
torture.
countries, literally solitary
It
confinement is
is.
abolished because it's
Right.
torture. So you have this 15-year-old client who's not adjusting well to prison and is constantly being sent to the hole, in other words,
Yep.
being put into solitary confinement.
And then after about 10 years of in and out and all this bad behavior, he said he was in solitary. He couldn't have any communication. That's the other thing. You can't contact your family and friends when you're in there. And he said to himself, I mean, this is how he tells it. He said to himself, "This might be the only place I ever am.
Mm,
And like, what am I going to do with this life?" Right. And he just had that sort of acknowledgement that prison might be his whole life. And it could be like this back and forth and angry and awful, or he could start to take steps, to change his life, that he still had a life. And that's part of what's so inspiring, that I have had so many clients who have life without parole sentences who do the work and
mhm.
transform and help other people like this person. And then they just get lucky that eventually I take their case and we have a governor who's willing to either let them out or send them to the parole board to prove themselves, right? But there's tons of people with life sentences that don't have a way out that do the work. And so this person's a great example. He got out in 2021 and he's doing amazing things. He's started an organization for people leaving prison that now, as people come out, they funnel right into it, and there they are. They have like family waiting for them, people who know what they've been through. And he's working for an international environmental organization in like an arts sort of role, where he's been traveling all over the world, and he was at the Biden White House.
That's
I mean,
amazing.
yeah, and you don't have to be that even extraordinary, right? Like you could just go home to your family. I have a lot of clients like that too. Just go home, get a job. I have a client who had life without parole, got out. He has a daughter, a grown daughter with a lot of mental health problems. His dream was to get a two-bedroom apartment and, be able to put her in one of them. And he's doing that, and works really hard, and he knows his daughter's safe. So there's just so many stories.
Yeah, and I mean, so both of those stories are really great illustrations, right, of the power of second chances. And, instead of costing taxpayers so much money to incarcerate people in a system that is so punitive, we release them and look at they do amazing things, either by helping their families be more
Mhm.
productive and safe or helping their communities.
Yeah,
Um,
there's definitely people who get, I would say, 8 out of 10 of my clients who get a second chance want to help other people
Mm.
and end up in roles like even more than their family, end up in roles where they participate in reentry programs, they become peer mentors and support, they become drug and alcohol counselors. I mean, they learn a lot of that stuff in prison, and then inspired when they go out to use all the skills that they learned or taught themselves or learned in programs. They feel, because I have the second chance, I'm going to work to prevent other people or to help other people. I'm on the board of an organization that was founded by formerly incarcerated people, and their whole goal is to sort of interrupt at a young age, throughout Oregon. And they're in a whole bunch of counties and rural counties and here in the city, like to interrupt teenagers and young kids' lives and offer them opportunities so they don't go into the system. I mean, who else should be doing that besides these folks, you know?
What's the name of the organization?
It's
Let's
called the
support them.
Yeah, Oregon Justice Network.
Okay, that's
Yeah,
awesome.
they're really
Well, I
amazing.
mean, it sounds like you really hit the ground running in Oregon and have made a tremendous difference there. Now, I promised we would get back to innocence just because I just had one question. I know there was this case that you worked on that wound up being like the first case in Oregon to actually get a certificate of innocence. And I don't know if you can go back there, but it was the Nicholas McGuffin case. And it's such an interesting case because it highlights so many things about what can
Yeah,
work, what is not working. And I thought maybe we could go out with that story and that kind of
sure.
what happened
So,
there.
I'm happy to talk about Nick's case. I just want to say that my amazing colleague and friend, Janice Purakel, is the lead lawyer on that case from the beginning, and she is also the other co-founder of the Oregon Innocence Project with me. She now runs an amazing organization that we thought of and started. We started Oregon Innocence, and after a couple years, we both left, and we started the Forensic Justice Project,
Mm,
which which hangs out in the space of science and cases. And she does the ton of work on innocence, the post conviction innocence work, but there's also an aspect of it where we educate and jump into cases at the front end. So we don't wrongfully convict people based on bad science, right? And so Nick's case actually came to the Innocence Project before we had even formed the organization. We were just talking, we had announced it, but we didn't really have a setup or anything. And I'll start by saying that Nick was convicted of killing a girlfriend, like high school girlfriend, and he was convicted by non-unanimous jury.
huh.
Right there, a lot of innocent cases in Louisiana and Oregon, you go back and you see that they were convicted by non-unanimous jury, which makes sense, right? That a
Yes,
bunch
right.
of people didn't think, right?
Hmm.
And he was charged initially, and tons of people were interviewed, and then the prosecutor at the time dropped the case. And then a bunch of years later, after he had a kid and was working and all this stuff, he got recharged and prosecuted and convicted by non-unanimous jury.